The gun was already cocked when Florence Conley slammed both palms flat against the sheriff's desk and looked the man dead in the eyes. "You are going to send that telegram," she said, her voice stripped of every soft edge it had ever possessed, "or I will walk out that door and burn every document your brother-in-law handed me in confidence, and you will never find the deed to this land again." Sheriff Roy Pittman leaned back in his chair with the lazy confidence of a man who had never once been told no by a woman and survived the experience intact. He was a broad, florid man with a mustache that curled at the ends like something decorative on a hotel curtain, and he smiled the way men smiled when they believed they already held all the cards. "Miss Conley," he said, drawing the name out slow and deliberate, the way a man stretches a rope before he loops it around something. "Your late husband left very specific instructions about how his affairs were to be managed. You are not among those instructions." "My late husband," Florence said, "has been dead for 14 months. His instructions died with him. The court sees it differently. The court," she said, "is 3 men who owe your brother money." That made him sit forward. The lazy smile flickered. Florence did not step back. She had learned, after 2 years married to Harlan Conley and 2 years before that under the roof of her father Emmett Dawes, that the moment you stepped back was the moment they believed the ground belonged entirely to them. She had spent her entire adult life watching men decide what she needed, what she felt, what was best for the widow, what was appropriate for the daughter, what was safe for the woman. She was 31 years old, and she had been managed and maneuvered and spoken over and smiled at and patted on the hand until the very nerve endings in her fingers had gone numb from all the gentle condescension. She was done with it. "Send the telegram," she said again, "to the land office in Amarillo, today." She walked out of that office into the blinding white heat of a July afternoon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1883, and she did not look back, because she knew if she looked back she would see Roy Pittman already reaching for his pen to write something entirely different than what she had demanded, and she needed to believe, at least until she reached the other end of the main street, that she had won something. She had not won anything. She knew that. The boardwalk was loud with boot heels, and the creak of wagon wheels, and the distant hammer of the blacksmith 3 streets over. The smell of dust and horses and something frying in the cookhouse on the corner wrapped itself around everything like a second skin. Caldwell in July was a particular kind of punishing, the sun overhead like a moral judgment, pressing down on every exposed surface until the wood bleached pale and the earth cracked into puzzle pieces. Florence walked with her chin level and her eyes straight forward and her hands very still at her sides, because her hands wanted to shake and she would not let them. She had come to Caldwell 3 weeks ago with a carpet bag, a leather satchel containing every legal document she had been able to remove from Harlan Conley's study before his brother Theodore arrived from St. Louis to begin the process of absorbing everything Harlan had owned into Theodore's considerably larger portfolio of holdings. Theodore Conley was a man of business. He was a man of process. He was a man who spoke of Florence with deep and touching concern in his voice, while simultaneously instructing his lawyer to file motions that would leave her with nothing but the dress on her back. The ranch outside Caldwell had been Harlan's, yes, but Florence had worked it. She had doctored cattle in the mud at 3 in the morning. She had kept the accounts and renegotiated the water rights agreement with the Anderson family to the south. She had been, in every functional sense, the operational center of 3,000 acres of grassland, and when Harlan died of the fever that swept through the territory in the spring of 1882, the ranch had continued to run because Florence had refused to let it stop. Theodore had arrived with papers that said none of that mattered. So Florence had gathered her own papers and come to Caldwell, which was the closest town with a telegraph office and a railroad connection, and a land office satellite clerk, and she had begun the slow, grinding, demoralizing work of fighting back. She had been fighting for 3 weeks, and she was exhausted down to the calcium in her bones. She turned off the main street onto the narrower road that ran alongside the grain storage building, heading for the boarding house where she had taken a room that was barely large enough to contain the bed and the washstand simultaneously. She needed to sit down. She needed water. She needed, if she was being entirely honest with herself, to put her face in her hands for approximately 5 minutes and make sounds that were not appropriate for the main street of any town that called itself respectable. She did not get 3 steps down the side road before she nearly walked directly into a man coming the opposite direction. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other. He was tall, which she registered first, and lean in the way that came from actual physical work rather than fashionable restraint. He had a face that had spent considerable time outdoors, weathered and angular, with dark eyes under the brim of a hat that had clearly seen better decades. He was carrying a saddle over one shoulder like it weighed nothing, and a set of surveying tools under the other arm, and he was dressed simply, working clothes that had been washed many times, a canvas shirt the color of old sage, dark trousers, boots with the dust of serious travel on them. He said, "Pardon me, ma'am," and stepped aside with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to give women room. She stepped the same direction he stepped. They blocked each other again. There was a brief, absurd moment where they both recalibrated. "Sorry," she said, and went left. He went right, and they were free. She made it 4 more steps before she heard him say, behind her, not loudly, "You were in the sheriff's office." She turned around slowly. He had not stopped walking, but he had turned his head, and his expression was not curious so much as careful, like a man who has learned that information is something you handle gently. "I was," she said. "Pittman give you any satisfaction?" He did not. The man with the saddle looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the way men nod when they're filing something away, and he turned and kept walking. Florence watched him go and thought nothing of it, because she had more pressing concerns than a stranger with surveying equipment and careful eyes. She went back to her boarding house room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she put her face in her hands, and she made the sound she had been holding back all morning. Then she washed her face, dried it with the rough towel that smelled faintly of lye soap, and sat down at the small table under the window to review her documents again. The land deed was, in her estimation, airtight. Harlan had purchased the property outright before their marriage, but there was a subsequent deed of addition, filed in 1880, for the northern parcel that had been purchased with money from the ranch's profits that the accounts clearly showed had been generated entirely during the years of Florence's management. The question was whether the Amarillo Land Office had the original registered copy, because the copy Theodore's lawyers were working from had been conveniently amended in a manner that removed the co-registration notation. Someone had altered it. She knew Theodore had done it, or had had it done, but knowing and proving were the same vast distance apart that the sky was from the ground. She was still staring at the documents when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find the landlady, Mrs. Hester Boone, a small, compact woman of about 55 who wore her gray hair pinned, with an efficiency that suggested she had never tolerated a stray piece of anything in her entire life. Hester Boone ran the boarding house with the systematic precision of someone who had decided long ago that chaos was a personal affront. "There is a man downstairs asking after you," Hester said, and her tone was the particular tone of a woman who was withholding judgment only temporarily. Florence set down the deed she had been holding. "What kind of man?" "The kind who knows your name and was polite about asking," Hester said. "He said his name is Milton Dunlap, and he said to tell you it was about the land office." Florence went downstairs. The man from the side road was standing in the entrance hall of the boarding house, hat in hand, the saddle no longer on his shoulder. He had left the surveying equipment somewhere. He looked slightly less imposing without the saddle, but still substantial in the particular way that came from a person who was entirely comfortable occupying the space they were in without needing to fill it with noise or gesture. "Mr. Dunlap," she said, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. Miss Conley, he said. He had a voice that was moderate in tone and pace, not fast, not slow, the voice of someone who chose words with some attention. I apologize for seeking you out. It's a presumption and I know it. What do you know about the land office? He looked at her steadily. I'm a surveyor. I've been working contract out of the Amarillo office for the past 4 years. I came up to Caldwell on a separate job this week, but I've seen your name in the documents. The Conley North parcel. Florence's attention sharpened into something extremely focused. What about it? The notation for co-registration was there when I surveyed the property boundary in 1881, Milton Dunlap said. I measured the stake lines myself. I filed the report. Whatever copy is being used now in these proceedings is not the copy I saw registered. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, she could feel Hester Boone hovering near the kitchen doorway with the barely concealed intensity of a woman who wanted very much to hear this conversation. Would you be willing to say that, Florence said, in a legal deposition? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? That one stopped him for just a moment. His dark eyes moved over her face, not in the invasive way of a man assessing a woman's appeal, but in the way of a man who was deciding whether a question deserved a careful answer or a quick one. Because the document was altered, he said, and that's a wrong thing. Florence had spent 3 weeks in Caldwell listening to men explain to her what they could and could not do, what was advisable and what was unwise, what she should consider, and what she was perhaps not seeing clearly. She had been patted on the hand, metaphorically and on one occasion quite literally, by the territorial judge's clerk. She had been advised by 2 different lawyers, both of whom had somehow already heard from Theodore's people before she arrived. She had been redirected and reframed, and managed with the patient thoroughness of people who believed her distress was a temporary condition that would resolve itself if she simply waited long enough and made decisions based on emotions rather than facts. This man had answered her question directly. She said, "Can you come tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock? I need to take down the details of what you saw and we need to establish a written record before we approach the court." 8 o'clock, he said. Yes. He put his hat back on, nodded to her, nodded to the invisible Hester in the direction of the kitchen doorway, and walked out. Florence stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the door closed. Then she went back upstairs, sat down at her table and began writing. She was still writing at midnight. She was up again at 6. By the time Milton Dunlap knocked at the front door of the boarding house at precisely 8 o'clock, Florence had a clean sheet of paper, 2 sharpened pencils, and a very precise list of the questions she needed answered. Hester Boone, who had apparently decided that providing coffee and her best biscuits to this particular meeting was within her jurisdiction as proprietress, appeared with a tray before anyone had time to arrange themselves properly at the small table in the front parlor that was used for such purposes. Milton Dunlap sat across from Florence, wrapped his hands around the coffee cup with the unself-conscious gratitude of a man who spent long days outdoors and understood the value of warmth, and answered her questions. He had surveyed the Conley North parcel in September of 1881, contracted through the Amarillo Land Office to establish the boundaries after the purchase was completed. The deed at that time had contained a co-registration clause indicating joint ownership rights, which had been standard for parcels purchased during active operation of an existing homestead. He had noted it because it was his job to note everything. He had filed his survey report with the Amarillo office. He had a personal copy of his field notes in his surveying case, which he had brought with him, and which he laid on the table between them. The field notes were in a compact, precise handwriting, the kind of handwriting that came from years of recording measurements, where accuracy was the difference between a good result and a dangerous one. Every notation was dated and initialed. The co-registration clause was referenced explicitly on the 3rd page. Florence read the 3rd page 4 times. "This," she said, "is the evidence that breaks the entire case Theodore Conley has built." "It would appear so," Milton said. She looked up from the page and studied him. He had the patience of someone who was used to working alone in large open spaces, the kind of quiet that didn't press on you or demand you fill it. "Mr. Dunlap," she said, "I want you to understand what you are stepping into. Theodore Conley is not a small man. He has money and lawyers and relationships with people who make decisions in this territory. If you testify or even sign a deposition, he is going to make your professional life very difficult." Milton picked up his coffee cup and thought about this for a moment. "Miss Conley," he said, "men who make other people's professional lives difficult because they told the truth about what they saw are a specific type of problem I've encountered before. They're manageable. You're not worried." "I didn't say that," he said. "I said they're manageable." She almost smiled. It surprised her enough that she pressed her lips together quickly. "All right," she said. "Then let's begin." They worked for 3 hours. Florence asked questions and Milton answered them, and she wrote everything down with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who had spent 2 years keeping the books for a cattle operation. She clarified terms, she established dates, she tracked the sequence of events with the care of someone building an argument that had to be airtight, because Theodore Conley's lawyers would look for every imprecision and excavate it until it was the size of a canyon. Milton answered everything without hedging, and without the particular kind of over-explanation that Florence had come to recognize as the sound of a man softening information, because he thought she needed it softened. He gave her the facts. He gave them to her straight and at her pace, and he waited, genuinely waited, when she needed to think rather than filling the silence with the low-grade noise of male reassurance that she had learned to endure as a standard feature of nearly every professional interaction she had experienced since becoming a widow. At the end of the 3rd hour, she put down her pencil and looked at him. "You are the first person in years who has not tried to manage me," she said with relief. It came out of her like something that had been pressed down behind a closed door and had finally found the door open. He looked up from the field notes he had been reviewing, and his expression was not confused by this statement, which told her he had understood the weight of what she said without needing it explained. "I imagine," he said quietly, "that has been exhausting, more than I can properly describe." "Well," he said, looking back at the notes, "I find it tends to produce better results when you just tell a capable person the relevant facts and let them do their work." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then she looked back at her paper, and something in the region of her chest that had been a tight knot for a very long time loosened by exactly 1 degree. It was a small thing. She noted it with the careful precision she brought to everything, and set it aside in favor of the more pressing problem of saving her land. They met again that afternoon to review the draft of the deposition she had prepared, and again the following morning to go over the supporting documents. And by the 3rd day, they had developed an efficient working rhythm, a shorthand almost, where she would reach for a reference and he would already have found the right page, where he would begin a technical explanation, and she would finish the relevant implication, where the silence between statements was not awkward but functional. She learned, in pieces over those days, that he was 35 years old and had been born in Waco, Texas, and had come west at 22 with a surveying kit he'd saved 2 years to buy, and a systematic education in cartography and land measurement that he'd acquired partly from a formal course, and partly from working under a German surveyor named Braun who had done boundary work across 3 territories and believed in precision with the fervor of a religious calling. He had been working independently for 9 years, contracting to various land offices and occasionally to the railroad when new routes required terrain assessment. He had no permanent home of the house with a porch variety. He lived between assignments in whatever accommodation was available, which was sometimes a proper room and sometimes a tent. He learned, in pieces, the inverse of what she offered, that she had grown up in Abilene in a family that was respectable by the standards of the time, her father a merchant who had done well enough to be comfortable and complacent, and that she had married Harlan Conley at 24, which was considered by everyone around her to be an appropriate and sensible decision since Harlan was 30 and established and reliably solvent. She had not been in love with Harlan, but she had respected him, and he had respected her operational intelligence in a way that she had come to understand, retrospectively, was rarer than it should have been. When he died, the respect went with him, and what was left was everyone else's opinion about what Florence Conley should do next. Milton listened to this without offering opinions about what Florence should have done or should do. He asked occasionally a clarifying question, the kind that indicated actual attention rather than performance of it. By the end of the first week, she trusted him completely with the legal strategy. That was the first thing she trusted him with. The deposition was filed with the county court on a Thursday morning in late July. Florence had also sent a letter directly to the Amarillo Land Office, bypassing the local clerk who was almost certainly in communication with Pittman, and had paid a writer she'd located through Hester Boone's recommendation to carry the letter personally rather than trusting the Postal Service with something this critical. The letter requested the original filed copy of the 1881 survey report, citing the specific date and contract number that Milton had provided from his own records. Theodore Conley arrived in Caldwell on the following Monday. Florence was at the counter of the general store purchasing writing paper when Theodore walked in. She knew him immediately, though she had only met him twice before, once at her wedding and once at Harlan's funeral. He was a heavier version of Harlan, the same features pressed into a larger mold, with the groomed authority of a man who had never spent time doubting whether rooms belonged to him. He saw her, and his expression went through several rapid negotiations before settling on something that was trying very hard to be warm and concerned. "Florence," he said, "I came as soon as I heard you were having difficulties." "Theodore," she said, and put her writing paper on the counter and told the storekeeper what she owed him. She did not look at Theodore while she counted the coins. "This entire situation has been a misunderstanding," Theodore said, following her to the counter with the determination of a man who had decided that the word misunderstanding was doing a great deal of useful work for him today. "If you had simply come to me when you had concerns rather than pursuing this rather aggressive legal course, we could have resolved everything quietly and kindly." "I did write to you," Florence said, taking her paper and turning to face him. "3 times in the 6 months following Harlan's death. The first letter was unanswered. The second was answered by your lawyer with a document requiring me to vacate the property. The third was answered by a sheriff's deputy who knocked on my door at 7 in the morning." Theodore's expression tightened around the edges but held its shape. "The legal requirements of the estate are not what I'm interested in discussing on the street in front of the general store," Florence said. "If you want to speak with me about the case, you may do so through the attorney I have retained." She had retained an attorney the previous Friday, a man named Paul Whitfield who had an office on the 2nd floor of the bank building, and who had taken the case with some enthusiasm once she laid out the deposition and the field notes. She walked out of the general store and did not look back. She was half a block away when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, a measured pace that she was beginning to know by sound, and Milton fell into step beside her. "He's here," she said. "I saw him ride in this morning," Milton said. He had been doing a job out at the east edge of town for a local farmer, measuring a boundary dispute between neighbors, a small, unglamorous job of the kind that apparently made up the steady middle of a surveyor's professional life. He brought 2 men with him. She stopped walking. "What kind of men?" "Not lawyers," Milton said. She absorbed this. "He's trying to frighten me. Probably." "It won't work." Milton looked at her. "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite admiration and not quite affection, and was, specifically, the sound of a person who has been watching another person operate under very difficult circumstances and has arrived at a genuine opinion about what they're seeing. "I don't expect it will." They walked to Paul Whitfield's office. because Florence wanted the attorney to know that Theodore had arrived with companions who were not lawyers, and because she wanted to move, to put the soles of her feet against the ground with purpose and feel the forward momentum of it. Whitfield received this information with the controlled alarm of a professional man who was beginning to understand that this case was more complicated than a standard property dispute. "The deposition is filed," he said. "The original survey document, if it arrives from Amarillo, will corroborate everything. At that point, Theodore Conley's lawyers will have a very difficult time explaining the altered copy." "When will we know if the original is retrievable?" Florence asked. "The writer should be back within the week." A week was a long time when Theodore Conley was in town with two men who were not lawyers. That evening, Florence sat in the boarding house parlor, which Hester Boone had implicitly made available for their working meetings, and which Florence had begun to think of as a kind of field headquarters. The lamp was turned up and the documents were spread across the table, and she was reviewing the sequence of the argument one more time when Milton came in from outside, where he had apparently been sitting on the front step for some time. He sat down across from her and watched her read for a moment. "You should eat something," he said. "I ate at supper." "You had 3 bites of Hester's stew and a biscuit," he said. "I was at the same table." She looked up. "Are you managing me?" He considered this with the seriousness it perhaps deserved. "I'm observing that a person cannot sustain a legal campaign on 3 bites of stew. That seems like a logistical point rather than a management decision." She looked at him for a moment, and then the thing that had been trying to happen for several days in the vicinity of her expression finally won, and she laughed. It was a short laugh, but it was a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine rather than from social performance, and it surprised her enough that she covered her mouth. Milton looked quietly pleased, not smug, not triumphant, just pleased, the way a person looks when something good has happened in the room. "There is cornbread left," he said. "Hester told me." "I know about the cornbread," Florence said. "I helped her make it this afternoon." "You helped Hester make cornbread and review legal documents today." "It was 2 hours between the morning meeting with Whitfield and the afternoon delivery of those letters," Florence said. "I was not going to sit idle." She paused. Hester also needed someone to talk to. Her husband has been gone 6 years and she is lonely in a way she does not allow herself to say directly. Baking is what she does with it. Milton was quiet for a moment. "You notice that?" "I notice people," Florence said. "Yes," he said, "I know." And then he looked away from her, out the window at the dark street, and she had the distinct impression that he was being careful about something, being precise the way he was precise with his surveying instruments, not because the precision was difficult but because he understood that imprecision in certain situations caused damage. She went back to her documents, but she ate the cornbread. The week that followed was a complex and highly pressured thing. Theodore's presence in Caldwell changed the climate of the town in subtle ways. He was staying at the hotel on Main Street, which was the best establishment Caldwell offered, and he was visible in the way that men with money are visible, at the dinner tables of men who mattered, and in conversations outside the bank, and in Roy Pittman's office for what Hester Boone's particular intelligence network reported as a meeting lasting well over 2 hours. One of the 2 men Theodore had brought with him appeared to be a private inquiry agent. Florence deduced this from the way he moved through town, not aimlessly but with the studied casualness of someone collecting information. She saw him twice near the boarding house. The third time she saw him near the boarding house, she sent Milton to explain to him that continued proximity would be noted in a written report to Paul Whitfield. The private inquiry agent did not appear near the boarding house again. Milton had this particular ability to convey things to people without making them into confrontations, a kind of quiet authority that came from being entirely clear about what he was saying and entirely unintimidated by whether the person hearing it liked it. Florence found this quality remarkable and somewhat singular in her experience. Men who were not confrontational were usually either ineffective or performing a softness they didn't feel. Milton was neither of those things. He was simply very calm and very direct, and those two things together made him, she was increasingly aware, quite formidable. She was thinking about this on the fourth morning of Theodore's occupation of the hotel when she was walking back from the post office, and Milton appeared from the direction of the feed store and fell into step beside her, which had become a pattern she had stopped noticing was a pattern, until she noticed herself looking for it when it didn't happen. "The rider is back," he said. She stopped walking. "He came in this morning," Milton said. "Whitfield already has the document." She was moving before she finished processing the sentence, and Milton kept pace without comment. The document was on Whitfield's desk when they arrived, a folded paper that had been carefully opened and laid flat, the original registered copy of the 1881 survey report with the land office seal in the lower right corner, and the co-registration notation intact and undisturbed on the third page, exactly where it appeared in Milton's field notes. Florence stood over the desk and read it twice. "This is it," she said. "Yes," Whitfield said, and even he, who had been professionally measured throughout their association, was sitting forward in his chair with something that looked like genuine excitement. "I can have a filing prepared by tomorrow that presents this document alongside the deposition and requests an emergency injunction against any further action on the estate until the matter of the altered deed copy is properly investigated." "File it today," Florence said. "The preparation requires, I will help you prepare it," Florence said. "Tell me what you need." Whitfield looked at her, then at Milton, then back at her. "All right," he said. "Let's begin." They were in Whitfield's office for 6 hours. Milton went out at midday and came back with food from the cookhouse down the street, and he set it on the corner of the desk without interrupting the work, and he sat in the chair by the window and read through the surveying case file Whitfield had accumulated, occasionally noting something that might strengthen a point or identifying a technical term in the documents that Whitfield had slightly misunderstood. Florence ate while she worked. She noticed the food was exactly what she would have chosen. The filing was complete by early evening. Whitfield walked it to the court clerk himself, because he wanted to see it enter the record with his own eyes, and Florence stood on the boardwalk outside his office building in the long light of a summer evening and breathed for what felt like the first time in several days. Milton was beside her. He had been beside her, she realized, for almost all of the last 11 days, in the particular way of someone who was genuinely useful rather than decorative. "We did it," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "You did it," he said. "I gave you a document." "You gave me the cornerstone," she said. "Everything else I built on top of it required the document." "You found the other documents," he said. "You made the argument, you retained Whitfield. You drove every conversation in every direction that mattered. I answered your questions." She turned to look at him, which required tilting her head back slightly because he was quite tall. The evening light was doing something warm to the planes of his face, and she noticed, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that he was a person she found genuinely pleasant to look at, which was an observation she filed away with the same care she was bringing to everything else at the moment. "You are very generous with other people's credit," she said. "I'm accurate," he said, and the corners of his mouth moved in the particular way they moved when he was not quite smiling but was in the vicinity of it. She looked at him for a moment in the evening light, and then she looked away at the street, where the day's traffic was thinning and the lamps in the storefronts were beginning to make the windows glow. "Milton," she said, and noticed that she had used his first name, which she hadn't done before. "Florence," he said, which answered the question she hadn't quite asked. She found herself smiling at the street. She felt him notice it without looking. The injunction was granted 2 days later. Theodore Conley's lawyers were given 30 days to respond and required to produce any documentation supporting their version of the deed copy, which they could not do because no such documentation existed in a form that would survive scrutiny now that the original was in evidence. Theodore himself, Florence was told by a source she had been quietly cultivating in the hotel's kitchen, had been on the telegraph machine for most of the morning following the injunction. He came to see her at the boarding house that afternoon. Florence received him in the front parlor with the door open and Hester Boone visible in the hallway. Theodore Conley sat in the chair across from her and looked at the woman his brother had married and seemed, for the first time since she had known him, to be slightly uncertain. "You've been very thorough," he said. "I have." Harlan would have been. He stopped himself. "He would have been unsurprised," Florence said. "He married me because I was capable. He knew what I was." Theodore was quiet for a moment, a quieter and more genuine quiet than he had managed in any of their previous interactions. "The lawyers believe we have less than 40% probability of success at this point," he said. "Yes," Florence said. "That sounds about right." He looked at his hat, which he was holding in both hands. "What do you want, Florence? If you could name it cleanly, what is it that you want?" "The ranch," she said. "The north parcel. The operating accounts as they stood at Harlan's death, less the legitimate expenses of the estate's administration, which I am willing to calculate jointly with your accountant provided there is a neutral third party present. Clear title in my name alone. And I want the lawyer who altered the deed copy reported to the Bar Association." Theodore's expression moved through several things. "The lawyer is a matter of principle," Florence said, "not negotiation." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You know," he said, "if Harlan had told me what you were like to deal with, I might have handled the whole thing differently from the start." "He knew," Florence said. "He chose not to tell you." Theodore left the boarding house and sent his lawyers a message that afternoon, and the lawyers sent Whitfield a message the following morning, and the process that followed was not simple or quick, but it was, at every stage, moving in Florence's direction. Milton was in Caldwell for the duration of it, which was unusual for a man whose work took him across a wide range of territory. When Florence mentioned this, on a morning 3 weeks after the injunction, when they were walking along the edge of town toward the livery because she had wanted to check on the horse she had brought from the ranch and left in their care, he said, with the careful precision she had come to expect from him, that he had a flexible schedule, and Caldwell seemed to him like a place worth staying in for a while. She looked at the side of his face when he said this. He was watching the path ahead of them. "For a specific reason?" she asked. "More than one," he said. She let this sit between them as they walked, testing its weight, feeling its shape. She was not a woman who misread things. She had been too finely attentive for too long to misread things, and she was not misreading this. She was also not unafraid of it. The last serious feeling she had held for a man had been somewhere in her early 20s, a feeling she had not acted on because the man in question had been her father's business partner's son, and the situation had been deemed inappropriate by everyone involved before it ever developed into something proper. After that had come the practical arrangement with Harlan, which had been decent and respectful and entirely devoid of the particular warmth that she had found herself thinking about in the quiet of the boarding-house room in the nights, since Milton Dunlap had sat across from her with his field notes and answered her questions directly. She was not afraid of many things. She had fought a legal case against a man with significant resources, and she was winning it. But this specific terrain was territory where she had been cautious so long that the caution had become a landscape feature. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I'm not particularly practiced at this," she said. He stopped walking and turned to look at her. She stopped too. The morning was already warm and the livery was 30 yards away, and there was the sound of a horse somewhere behind them and the smell of dry grass and sun. "At what?" he asked. "At allowing something," she said, and then stopped, because that was not quite the sentence she had meant to produce. She tried again. "I have been very careful for a long time about what I allow myself to feel. Because feelings, in my experience, have frequently been used as evidence that I needed to be managed." He was listening to her with his complete attention, the way he listened to everything, with the quality of stillness that was not passivity but engagement. "I don't think," she said, "that you would do that, use them that way." "No," he said, "but I am telling you because I want you to know that I am not unaware of what has been happening between us. I am simply being careful with it, because I am careful with things that matter to me." Something moved in his face that was not the almost smile, was something quieter and more internal than that. He said, "Florence," and then he seemed to arrive at the decision that what he wanted to say was better said than managed, and he said, "I have been trying very conscientiously not to introduce any element that might feel like pressure into a situation where you are already navigating an enormous amount of pressure." "I know," she said, "and I have been, if I'm being direct, not entirely succeeding at the not caring about you part." She looked at him. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have also not been entirely succeeding at that part." The morning was very bright and very still around them, and the horse in the livery yard made a soft sound, and somewhere down the street a door banged in the wind. Milton reached out and took her hand with the careful deliberateness of a man who was used to measuring things and understanding that precision mattered. He held it, just held it, and looked at her, and she did not move away. She looked down at their joined hands and then back up at his face. "We are standing in the middle of the path to the livery," she said. "We are," he agreed. "Hester will see us from the window. She's probably already seen us," he said. "She will have opinions." "I expect so." Florence looked at him for another moment, and then she turned and they walked to the livery together, and she did not take her hand back. The settlement with Theodore Conley's lawyers was finalized 6 weeks after the injunction was granted, in late September of 1883. Florence received clear title to the ranch, the north parcel, the operating accounts with the adjustments calculated by a neutral accountant from Wichita, and Theodore's personal written assurance that no further legal action would be pursued, which Whitfield had insisted on including, and which Florence had insisted be notarized. The lawyer who had altered the deed copy was reported to the Bar Association. He lost his license the following spring. Florence stood in Whitfield's office on the morning the final papers were signed and looked at her name on the deed, Florence Ann Conley, sole registered owner, and felt the specific quality of relief that comes not from something new beginning but from something true being restored to its proper state. Whitfield shook her hand with genuine warmth. He was, she thought, a good man who had needed the right case to become a better lawyer. She walked out onto the street and found Milton waiting on the boardwalk, leaning against the wall with his hat tipped forward and his arms crossed, the patient posture of a man who was comfortable waiting for things that were worth waiting for. "It's done," she said. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him smile, the full version of the smile this time, the one she had been collecting observations of for 2 months without letting herself catalog it as the significant thing it was, and it was, she admitted now, quite a significant thing. "Then let's celebrate," he said. They ate dinner at the hotel that evening, because the hotel had the best kitchen in Caldwell and Florence had decided that the occasion warranted it. Hester Boone had been informed, and had received the news with the brisk emotional efficiency of a woman who had predicted this outcome from approximately the second day, and had been modulating her satisfaction accordingly. She sent them off with the instruction that Florence was to enjoy herself and not look at a single document. The hotel dining room was not grand by the standards of any major city, but it had tablecloths and candles and a cook who knew what to do with a good piece of beef and a decent root vegetable, and by the measure of what Caldwell, Kansas had to offer in 1883, it was entirely adequate for a celebration dinner. They talked differently that evening, not about the case. The case was done, and they had spent 2 months talking about the case with the focused intensity of people for whom it was the most important thing in the room. And now, it was not the most important thing in the room, and the conversation found its way to other ground. He told her about a survey job he had done the previous year in the mountains near the New Mexico border, where the terrain was nothing like the Kansas flatlands, and the work required a different kind of attention, a constant recalibration as the elevation changed. He told her about making camp in a canyon where the acoustics were strange, and you could hear water running a mile away like it was at your elbow. He told her about the German surveyor Braun, who had died 2 years ago of a heart complaint in El Paso, and whom Milton had genuinely mourned. She told him about the ranch in the early days of her marriage, when she was learning everything simultaneously, the cattle and the accounts and the land itself, the way grass grew in different patches according to water and soil and aspect, the particular language of a working ranch that was not like any other language she had encountered. She told him about the night a river flooded and she and the ranch hands had worked from sundown to sunrise moving cattle to higher ground, and how Harlan had been in town and she had made every decision that night and everything had been fine. "Was he proud of you?" Milton asked. "He was relieved," she said, "which was its own kind of pride, I think. He was a man who worried a great deal, and not having to worry about the ranch was a significant gift to him. And what did you need from it?" She looked at her hands on the tablecloth, then back at him. "The work itself," she said. "The knowledge that I was the right person for the thing, that's what I needed." He nodded, understanding this without making it bigger than it was. "What do you need from it?" she asked. "The surveying." He thought about this with the genuine attention he brought to questions that deserved it. "The precision," he said, "and the solitude sometimes. There's a particular quality of attention that's possible when you're working alone in open country that isn't available in other circumstances." He paused. "And the accuracy of it. When the lines are right, the land is right. Things are where they actually are. There's a satisfaction in that." "You like truth," she said. "I like things that are true," he said. "Yes." They walked back to the boarding house under a clear September sky full of stars, in the particular extravagant quantity that Kansas offered, far from any city large enough to dim them. The air had cooled and Florence was wearing the wool wrap she had brought because September evenings in the territory could deceive you and she had learned not to be deceived by weather. They stopped at the front gate of the boarding house. She turned to face him. "Milton," she said. "Florence," he said. She had been thinking throughout the evening about what she wanted. It was a question she had not allowed herself the luxury of often, the question of what Florence Conley wanted when the practical necessities were addressed. And the practical necessities were now addressed. And the question was waiting for her in the most immediate and particular terms she had encountered in many years. "I am going back to the ranch," she said. "I need to be there. I need to see it and walk it and understand what 2 years of reduced management has done to it, and I need to begin rebuilding what needs rebuilding." "Yes," he said, "but I want to ask you something before I go." He waited. "I would like you to come with me," she said. "Not as a surveyor, although there is work on the property that probably requires a survey, but as a person I want to see more of." She stopped, and then, because she was a woman who had decided that imprecision was a luxury she could no longer afford in any arena of her life, she said, "I am telling you that I care for you. Not managed, not performed. Actually." He looked at her in the starlight for a long moment, and his expression was the open, carefully honest thing she had come to understand, was what Milton Dunlap looked like when he was feeling something he wasn't trying to contain. "Florence," he said, "I have thought about almost nothing but how to say this correctly since approximately the 3rd day I knew you. And I care for you," he said, "in a way that I would very much like to understand better in the context of significantly more time together." She said, "Good." He said, "Good." And then he kissed her, which was the kind of event that deserves its own careful notation, a deliberate and unhurried thing, the way he did everything. And she was present for it in a way she had not been present for very much in a very long time, with all of herself rather than the portion she generally kept available for interactions that required her to be guarded. Hester Boone saw it from the parlor window and was, quietly, extremely satisfied. The following 3 weeks were the process of leaving Caldwell. Florence had correspondence to complete, final documents to receive from Whitfield, a wire to send to the foreman at the ranch, a man named Cabrera who had worked for Harlan for 10 years, and whom Florence trusted completely, and who had, she suspected, been keeping the place from complete deterioration through sheer professional stubbornness. Milton had his own affairs to organize, including a notification to the Amarillo Land Office that he would be unavailable for the next period. Hester Boone extracted a promise from Florence to write. Florence gave it sincerely, which was the only way she gave anything. They left Caldwell on a bright October morning with horses, a wagon with Florence's accumulated belongings including the carpet bag and the satchel and several boxes of documents, and 2 things she had purchased at the general store that she was allowing herself as something approaching an extravagance, a proper ledger, and a set of copper-tipped pencils. Milton rode his own horse, a dark bay mare named Clover, which was a name so gentle for a horse built like that one that Florence had laughed when she heard it and asked him why. "She was Clover when I got her," he said. "It seemed unkind to change it." The ranch was 3 hours' ride southeast of Caldwell, on the flat grassland that opened out from the town like a promise of space. Florence felt the territory becoming familiar under her as they rode, recognized the shapes of things, the particular bend in a dry creek bed, the silhouette of a cottonwood stand that she had used as a landmark when riding the property lines. Something in her that had been held at a low, unacknowledged ache for 2 years began, very quietly, to ease. The ranch house came into view as the afternoon light was beginning to angle low, a solid wood-framed structure that was not large but was well built, with a covered porch along the front and outbuildings arranged with the functional logic of people who had thought about how work actually moves. It needed paint. Several fence posts along the east approach needed replacement. The kitchen garden had gone to wild grass. Florence looked at all of it and felt enormously, ferociously glad to be there. Cabrera came out from the direction of the barn when he heard the horses. A compact man in his 50s, with the leather-dark skin of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life, and the direct, evaluating gaze of someone who had kept this place, running through extremely difficult circumstances on the strength of professional loyalty and personal stubbornness. "Mrs. Conley," he said, with the particular quality that communicated relief, professional validation, and a long list of operational updates held in reserve. "Cabrera," she said, "tell me everything. Start with the water situation." He told her everything, walking her through the property as the sun went down, and Milton walked with them and listened and asked occasional questions that revealed, to Florence's private appreciation, a detailed understanding of land and water and fence and pasture that went beyond the theoretical and into the practical. Cabrera looked at Milton sideways twice in the course of this walk and said nothing, which was, Florence recognized, a comprehensive positive assessment in Cabrera's particular dialect of communication. They ate that evening in the kitchen, Cabrera's wife Alina having produced food from what Florence suspected were fairly limited available resources, a fact Florence intended to correct substantially at the earliest opportunity. Alina Cabrera was a quiet, steady woman who said little and understood everything, and who brought Milton a second helping of beans before he asked for it, and looked at Florence with an expression that communicated approval. The ranch was not in the state of ruin that Florence had feared. It was in the state of a place that had been maintained under constraint, not thriving but surviving, intact in its essential structure and ready to be rebuilt. Cabrera had kept the core herd, had made hard decisions about what to sell and what to keep, had maintained the water infrastructure with resourcefulness that Florence intended to acknowledge formally, and in the form of significantly improved wages. She sat up late that first night at the kitchen table with Cabrera's operational notes and her new ledger, and began to map out the first year's plan. She could hear Milton in the other room, in the spare room she had offered him, which he had accepted with the practicality they both brought to logistics. She heard him, at some point, stop moving and she knew he was asleep. She kept writing. The fall and winter that followed were the most grounded and purposeful months Florence could remember in a very long time. The ranch reasserted itself around her as she put in the work of reasserting it, the cattle numbers building back as she made selective purchases at the market in November, the fence lines being repaired through December with help from 2 new ranch hands she hired through Cabarrú's network, the accounts rebuilding in the ledger with the methodical satisfaction of numbers that told a true story. Milton was there through all of it. He had stayed because she had asked him and because, as he put it with characteristic directness when she raised the question of what he was doing about his professional life, there was survey work to be done on the property and he was doing it, and there was also the separate matter of not wanting to be anywhere else, which he stated as a fact rather than a declaration. He surveyed the full property in November, establishing precise boundaries and identifying 3 areas where water rights were ambiguous in a way that he recommended formalizing. He helped rebuild fence. He was useful with horses in the understated way of a man who had spent significant time in territories where your horse was how you survived. He learned the ranch's particular rhythms and inserted himself into them without disrupting them. He did not attempt to manage any aspect of Florence's operation. She discussed decisions with him because she valued his perspective, and because talking through problems aloud was how she did some of her best thinking. But he was scrupulous about the distinction between his perspective and her decision, in a way that she noticed and valued so precisely that she would not have known how to explain it to anyone who had not spent years in circumstances where that distinction was routinely collapsed. They were sitting on the porch one evening in late November, in the cold air that made the stars seem extremely close and the silence seem enormous, and Florence said, "I have been thinking about the spring cattle purchase. I want to expand the herd by 40%. That's ambitious," he said. "The water supports it now that the southern creek has been properly cleared," she said, "and the grass on the north parcel is better than I remembered." Cabarrú agrees. "Then it seems like the right call," he said. She looked at him. The lamp through the window was doing something to the side of his face that she found herself wanting to look at for an unreasonable amount of time. "You never argue with me," she said. "I argue with you regularly," he said, "when I think you're wrong about something." When was the last time? He thought about it. "The fence material," he said. "You wanted to use the cheaper wire on the west boundary and I thought the heavier gauge was worth the cost given the terrain." "You were right," she said. "I know," he said. "You agreed with me after we walked the terrain together." "I agreed because you were right," she said, "not because you argued longer." "Yes," he said. "That's how it's supposed to work." She looked back out at the dark grassland and the enormous sky. "My father never argued with my mother," she said. "He simply did what he intended to do and allowed her to believe she had been consulted. That sounds exhausting for everyone involved." "It was," she said, "particularly for my mother." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Florence." Something in the way he said her name had changed over the months they had been here, had acquired a quality of warmth and intention that made it feel different from a simple address. "Yes," she said. "I have been trying to identify the correct time to ask you something," he said, "and I am not certain that there is a correct time, which suggests that I may be overthinking the question of timing." She turned to look at him. His expression was the careful, genuine one, no performance in it, nothing managed. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you are willing, not because of the ranch or the land or any practical arrangement. Because I have been sitting on this porch in the cold with you, and the last thing in the world I want is to be anywhere else." Florence Conley looked at Milton Dunlap on the porch of her ranch in the cold November dark under the stars of the Kansas Territory in the year 1883 and felt, with a clarity that had very little softness in it and a great deal of simple truth, that she had arrived somewhere she had been moving toward without knowing the name of it. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the same careful deliberateness as the first time, and she held his hand back with everything she had decided to stop protecting herself from, and they sat there in the dark for a long time, not saying anything, because the silence was the exact right language for it. They were married in February of 1884, in the small church in the nearest town, which was a 7-mile ride from the ranch, and which had a minister named Reverend Abernathy, who was a brisk and efficient man of faith, who had married a great number of people on the Kansas frontier, and had developed a ceremony that managed to be both sincere and brief, which Florence appreciated. Hester Boone came from Caldwell, which required her to arrange for Mrs. Folger next door to take the boarding house for 2 days, a logistical sacrifice she made with complete willingness and without mentioning it more than twice. Paul Whitfield came with his wife. Cabrera and Alina came, and 2 of the ranch hands, and Reverend Abernathy's wife, who played the small organ in the corner and managed 3 hymns with considerable feeling. It was a cold February day, and the church was heated by a wood stove that worked with intermittent enthusiasm, and Florence wore a dress that was not a wedding dress because she did not own a wedding dress and had not wished to purchase one, being of the opinion that the ceremony was the important part, and the dress was a deep blue that Alina had told her was the right color, and Alina was not wrong. Milton wore his good clothes, which were not significantly different from his working clothes but had been laundered with extra care and had a jacket over the shirt. He stood beside her in front of Reverend Abernathy and looked at her with the quiet attention she had come to understand was the fundamental mode of his regard for her, not rapturous or theatrical but entirely, unmistakably real. When Reverend Abernathy asked the relevant questions, they answered them directly. After, there was food at the ranch, Alina having performed something remarkable with a fortnight's planning and limited supplies, and Hester Boone having brought a cake from Caldwell in a box on her lap the entire 7-mile ride, which she reported had been somewhat challenging but worth it. And there was warmth and noise, and the particular quality of celebration that comes from people who know each other genuinely rather than socially. When everyone had gone and Cabrera and Alina were back in the foreman's house and the ranch hands in the bunkhouse, Florence and Milton sat by the fire in the main room and the ranch was quiet around them. "Well," Florence said. "Well," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had been doing, progressively, for several months, and which still felt like a choice rather than a habit, a thing she was actively doing rather than passively permitting. He put his arm around her. Outside, the February wind moved across the grassland, and the fire in the stove made the particular comfortable sounds that fires make, and everything that had been complicated and frightened, and contested and managed and stripped from her was settled, at last, into its proper order. The spring of 1884 was the best Florence had known since she came to the ranch. The 40% herd expansion she had planned went smoothly, aided by a cattle market that was operating in their favor, and by Cabrera's extensive knowledge of which sellers could be trusted and which could not. The north parcel opened up for grazing in April when the grass came in better than it had the year before, the result of the creek clearing that had been done in the fall. The accounts told a story that Florence found genuinely satisfying, the story of a ranch rebuilding from a period of constraint back into productivity. Milton had contracts to fulfill. He was not, had never been, a man who was going to stop working, and Florence had never wanted him to stop, because she understood work at that level, the kind that was not just occupation but part of how a person organized their understanding of themselves. He went out on survey jobs in April and May, each time for a week or 10 days, returning to the ranch between jobs. They had agreed on this honestly and specifically, as they agreed on most things, and the agreement included correspondence, which Milton sent from wherever he was in the careful, precise handwriting she had first seen in his field notes, letters that were not effusive but were entirely sincere, and told her things she found she thought about for days after reading them. She wrote back with equal regularity, news of the ranch and also other things, observations and reflections that she had been gathering for years without anyone to direct them to, and which flowed out of her with a fluency that surprised her, as though the door she had opened that evening on the porch in November had remained open. In June, she understood that she was expecting a child. She told Milton on the evening he returned from his most recent job, a survey near the Oklahoma border that had taken 2 weeks. He came in from the barn smelling of horse and distance, and she met him in the kitchen where Alina had left supper covered on the stove, and she told him directly because there was no other way to tell him anything. He set down his hat and looked at her, and then he did something she had seen him do before, only with things of very great significance. He took a breath and held it for just a moment, the pause of a person receiving something large. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "I have been somewhat tired and the mornings have been unpleasant, but it is passing." "When?" "February, I think. The doctor in town agrees." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands, carefully, the way he touched everything he considered significant, and looked at her. "A February child," he said. "Our anniversary month," she said. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, and she put her hands over his, and they stood in the kitchen while the supper kept warm on the stove, and the Kansas summer evening came in through the window. The fall of 1884 passed in the deep, productive way of a ranch in its proper working rhythm. Florence managed the operations with the same attentive precision she had always brought to it, and her condition was not, as she had somewhat feared might be the implication, a reason for anyone to make decisions on her behalf. Cabrera continued to report to her, as he always had. Milton continued to offer observations and defer to her judgment, and argue on the occasions when he believed she was wrong, which had the statistical frequency she had come to trust. There was one morning in October when she was attempting to move a supply inventory in the storeroom, and Milton appeared in the doorway and offered to help without making it about her condition, simply offering because the inventory was heavy and 2 people were more efficient than 1, and they did it together in the same functional shorthand they brought to everything. She loved him with a thoroughness and a rootedness that still had the quality of a surprise to her, not the fact of it but the texture, the way it was not like anything she had imagined love to be when she was younger, and imagining was still something she allowed herself. It was less like a feeling and more like a state of things, a condition of her existence, present and reliable and always precisely itself. Their son was born on a cold night in February of 1885, almost exactly a year after their wedding, and Dr. Henry from the town came out in the dark, and Alina was there, and Milton stayed outside the door and walked approximately 400 miles in the hallway in his anxious patience. The birth was not without difficulty, but Florence was a woman who dealt with difficulty by focusing with extreme precision on the task at hand, and the task at hand was getting through it, and she got through it. The sound the child made when he arrived was the loudest and most indignant sound that had ever been produced in that ranch house and possibly in the surrounding territory. Alina brought Milton in. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child in Florence's arms with an expression that was so entirely open and unguarded that she felt the sight of it register somewhere very deep. "He is angry about something," Milton said. "He has opinions already," Florence said. "Good." They named him James, for no particular literary reason, but because Florence had always liked the name and Milton had no objection to it, and it was a name that would sit well on a person. James Dunlap grew up on the ranch with the particular confidence of a child who was entirely at home in his landscape. He was walking by the time summer came, and causing systematic problems by the time fall arrived, and Cabrera, who had no children of his own and who had taken one look at James with the calculating assessment of a man identifying a project, became something between a grandfather and a foreman of child management, which suited everyone. The ranch continued to grow. By 1886, the herd was at the size Florence had originally imagined. The accounts were in the best condition they had been since before Harlan's death, and the north parcel had been fully integrated into the operation with the clarity of title that the original deed had promised, and Theodore Conley's lawyers had attempted to deny her. She heard from Theodore once more in the spring of 1886, a brief letter that was formal in the way of a man who has arrived at a posture and intends to hold it indefinitely. He acknowledged the outcome of the legal matter. He wished her well in the careful language of someone who has lost. Florence read the letter, noted it, filed it, and did not spend further time on it. Whitfield wrote occasionally with legal news from Caldwell. Hester Boone wrote with the compressed density of a woman who had a great deal to communicate and believed in efficiency, and her letters were always the most entertaining of Florence's correspondence. She had, it emerged from one letter, taken in a young woman as an assistant who showed promise, and was teaching her the boarding house management with a thoroughness that Florence recognized as Hester's particular form of legacy. Milton came and went on survey jobs through 1885 and into 1886, but the ratio shifted, more time at the ranch and less away, partly because the survey contracts had settled into a pattern that allowed for longer intervals between jobs, and partly because James, at 1 year old, and then at 18 months, was a fact of the world that required a certain amount of presence to properly appreciate. In the summer of 1886, Florence came in from the north pasture in the late afternoon, dusty and slightly sunburned from a day of riding the property lines, and found Milton sitting on the porch step with James installed on his knee, both of them engaged in what appeared to be a very serious conversation about a stick that James was holding. Florence stopped at the gate and watched them and felt something so large and uncomplicated that she could not have produced the right word for it on demand. She walked up to the porch. "The stick," she said. "It's an important stick," Milton said. "We've discussed it at length." James offered her the stick. Florence accepted it with the gravity it deserved. "Sit down," Milton said, and she sat beside him on the step, and James transferred his interest to a beetle that had appeared from somewhere at the base of the step, and the evening was long and gold and unhurried around them. "I've been thinking," Milton said. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking since noon. I could see it from the north pasture." He looked at her. "You could see me thinking from the north pasture." "I know what you look like when you're thinking," she said. "You go very still." He was quiet for a moment, which was evidence for her thesis. "I've been thinking about whether to take on a permanent contract with the Amarillo office," he said. "They've offered a position, managing the survey contracts for the Northern Territory. It would mean less field work and more coordination, which is not what I have preferred historically, but it would mean I could be based here instead of traveling for months at a time." Florence looked at his profile. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you think," he said. "I asked you first," she said. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. "I want to be here," he said. "The field work is good work and I don't want to give it up entirely, but I could do shorter contracts, closer to home, and the coordination role is work I'm actually well suited for." "Then accept the position," she said. "It would mean a reduction in contract income initially." "Milton," she said, "have you looked at our accounts recently?" He had. They both knew he had. He was not raising the financial concern in earnest. He was, she recognized, offering her the opportunity to state that it didn't matter, because the offer to give up field work, which was work he loved, was a significant thing, and he wanted to know she knew it was significant. "It doesn't matter," she said. "And what you would be giving up matters. I want you to know I see that." He looked at her for a long moment with the open, unguarded expression. "All right," he said. James found the beetle extremely interesting and communicated this at some volume. Milton accepted the position with the Amarillo Land Office and managed survey contracts from the ranch, with occasional shorter field trips of a week or two when a specific job required his expertise. It was a life with a shape that worked for all the people in it. Florence continued to run the ranch with the complete authority she had fought for and won, and the ranch continued, year by year, to be the thing she had known it could be when she had refused to let Theodore Conley take it from her. She hired 2 additional ranch hands in 1887 and promoted Cabrera to a formal foreman role with the wages and authority the title deserved. Alina's kitchen garden was restored to something magnificent. James learned to ride at 3. He was, as Milton noted with the neutrality of a man trying to be fair about his son's capabilities, an exceptionally stubborn child. Florence found this quality familiar and entirely acceptable. In the fall of 1887, Florence understood she was expecting another child. This one arrived in April of 1888, in the spring, which the doctor said was a much more convenient time than February from a professional standpoint. This child was a girl, and she arrived in the world with considerably less of James's aggrieved energy and considerably more of what would prove to be a lifelong quiet alertness, a child who watched everything and said nothing until she had formed a complete opinion. They named her Clara. James received Clara with the wariness of a 3-year-old who has not yet formed a policy on siblings, studied her for several days, and eventually decided she was acceptable, a verdict he communicated by bringing her a stick, which was the highest honor in his current philosophical system. The ranch in 1888 was the fullest it had been. Cattle and children, and the sounds of a working property in its proper life. Cabrera calling across the yard, and the horses moving in the paddock, and Alina singing something in the kitchen, and James's running feet on the porch boards, and Clara's serious infant attention turning from one thing to another. Florence sat at the kitchen table one evening in May with the ledger open in front of her, the accounts for the first quarter, which were as good as any she had seen. The window was open, and the evening air came in carrying the smell of grass and the last of the day's warmth. She could hear Milton outside, talking to one of the ranch hands about a fence issue near the east boundary. She set down her pen and listened to his voice in the evening air. She thought about the day she had walked out of Roy Pittman's office in Caldwell, defeated and exhausted, and not yet out of fighting, but feeling the specific weight of fighting alone for too long. She thought about the side road and the collision and the man with the saddle and the surveying tools and the careful eyes. She thought about the boarding house parlor and the field notes laid flat on the table and the questions she had asked and the answers he had given her, straight and at her pace and without softening. She thought about saying, out loud, to another person for the first time in years, what it was to be met without being managed. She had thought in that moment that she was talking about the legal case. She understood now that she had been talking about everything. The door opened and Milton came in from outside, slightly dusty, and looked at her at the table in the lamplight and said, "The accounts." "Good," she said. "Better than good." He washed his hands at the basin and came and sat across from her, and she turned the ledger to show him the numbers, and he looked at them with the genuine interest of a person who found the story the numbers told to be worth reading. "Florence," he said. "Milton," she said. The lamp made a warm circle around the table, and outside the spring evening was settling into night, and upstairs Clara was presumably sleeping, and James had been considerably less presumably sleeping, but had been at least quiet for 20 minutes, which was sufficient. The ranch was quiet around them with the productive quiet of a place that was well and properly itself. "I want to show you something," Milton said, and he produced from his shirt pocket a folded piece of paper, which he opened and set on the table beside the ledger. It was a survey sketch. She recognized it as the Conley property, the full boundary, drawn with his characteristic precision, every line and notation exact. "I've been updating this," he said, "incorporating all the changes we've made, the creek adjustment, the new fence lines, the pasture divisions. I thought you should have a current, accurate map." She looked at the sketch. Every feature of the land she had known for years was there, rendered in his careful hand, true to itself. In the lower corner, in the neat surveyor's script she had first seen in his field notes in a boarding house parlor 3.5 years ago, he had written, "Milton Dunlap Ranch, Caldwell, Kansas, 1888. Florence A. Dunlap, proprietor." She looked at it for a long moment. "Proprietor," she said. "You built this," he said. "The map should say who built it." She looked up from the sketch to his face, and what she felt looking at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the ranch quiet around them and their children sleeping above, and the accounts in good order and the land outside exactly where it was supposed to be, was the thing she had been moving toward since she had slammed her palms on a sheriff's desk in the summer of 1883 and refused to be managed anymore. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Milton," she said. "Florence," he said. "I am very glad you were walking down that side road," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "So am I," he said. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, the same stars she had looked up at from this land for years, and they were exactly where they had always been, precise and reliable, fixed in the pattern that careful attention could learn to read, illuminating for anyone who looked the true shape of the world. The ranch continued on. James learned to read from his mother's patient instruction, and to survey measurements from his father's patient instruction, and combined both of these skills into an early habit of measuring everything in the house and recording the results in a small notebook, a habit that Cabrera found profoundly useful and Alina found mildly inconvenient. Clara, as she grew, turned out to be Florence with additional patience, a quality that would serve her well. Milton's coordination role with the Amarillo office expanded by 1890 into something that was, effectively, the management of land registration quality across the northern territorial boundary, a position that drew on his years of field expertise and his native precision and his thorough understanding of how documents and land and truth were supposed to align. He was, by the measure of the land office, one of the most effective people they had ever employed in any capacity, and they told him so, which he received with the understated acknowledgement of a man who was glad the work was good, but was not in the practice of building his sense of self on other people's opinions of it. Florence received, in the spring of 1890, a letter from Hester Boone reporting that Paul Whitfield had been appointed to a judgeship in Wichita, which Hester described as long overdue, and Florence agreed with completely. She wrote back to say so, and to send the news from the ranch, and to include, because she knew Hester would want them, pressed flowers from the kitchen garden that Alina had planted along the south wall of the house, which bloomed every spring in a riot of color that was the specific opposite of the bleached and cracked July landscape Florence had walked through in 1883 when everything was at its lowest. Summer of 1890. James was 5 and Clara was 2, and the ranch was in its 7th year of Florence's sole ownership, and its 6th year of being in practice, the life she and Milton had built together. The cattle numbers were at the level she had planned in 1883 when she had sat at a small table in a boarding house room and refused to stop fighting. The land was producing. The accounts were not merely good but excellent. Florence stood on the porch one morning in July, the same punishing July quality she remembered from Caldwell, the sun pressing down on every surface, and she looked out at the grassland and the cattle visible as dark shapes in the middle distance, and the sky enormous and unyielding overhead. Milton came out and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee, which was the morning custom that had been established sometime in the first year and had never been revised. She took the cup, they stood in the heat and looked at the land. "It's a good ranch," Milton said. "It is," Florence said. "You made it that." "We made it this," she said, and it was not a negotiation or a correction but simply the accurate thing, what the map said, what the land knew, what the accounts reflected. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of the Conley Dunlap ranch in the summer morning, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, exactly what it was, exactly where it was, true and measured and wholly theirs. Inside, James woke up and began to negotiate with some energy about breakfast, and Clara's serious voice joined the negotiation with her characteristic precision, and Cabrera's whistle sounded from the direction of the barn, and Alina called something from the kitchen, and the ranch came alive into its day. Florence set down her empty cup and turned toward the door, toward the noise and the work in the morning, and Milton's hand was warm at her back as she went in, and the screen door banged behind them both, and the day began.